Hi, this is Kalki and you're watching the YouTube version of My Indian Life. You can also find us on any podcast or audio streaming app that you use. And if you like us and you want to support us, we would love you to leave a review. Trust me, it makes a big difference. And now, time for our next episode.
The number you are calling is currently switched off. Please try later.
Oh, it says it's switched off.
We're bringing you a story which has been difficult to tell, and even more difficult for some to live.
Freedom! Freedom! हम क्या चाहते हैं? हम क्या चाहते हैं?
This is Ishleen Kaur, our producer.
So this week's episode began one Sunday in August when I was at a gig in Delhi watching a rising rapper, Ahmer Javed. He comes from Indian-administered Kashmir. Kashmir is the Himalayan region that both India and Pakistan lay claim to. And I thought it would be really great to speak to Ahmer for the podcast. As, you know, Kashmir is somewhere many of us go for a holiday, but we don't really know what it's like to live there and grow up there. So we had a quick chat before he went on stage. Everything was going to plan. I was going to fly out to Kashmir a few days later to meet his family and his friends. But then, Ahmer had this moment on stage. And something changed. I could see something was wrong.
What had happened?
He'd just heard that the Indian Army had sent more troops to Indian-administered Kashmir, and he was having trouble getting through to his family.
Outrage as India strips Kashmir of its autonomy. Tens of thousands of extra troops have been sent.
And he flew home 2 days later, and then he stopped answering my calls. Kashmir was in lockdown by then, and you couldn't get hold of anyone. But I was just doing my work, right? But imagine for anyone who was trying to get hold of their loved ones.
And this was what, early in August 2019?
Yeah, and I would message him every day on WhatsApp, but no blue ticks, nothing. And then finally, after 2 weeks, I saw blue ticks on my WhatsApp. So I got on a plane to Ahmer's home in Srinagar, and I finally met up with him again. And we spoke about him doing the podcast, and that's how we got here to this week's episode.
From the BBC World Service, this is My Indian Life with me, Kalki Kekla, bringing you stories of being young and Indian in the 21st century. Episode 2, Rapping Kashmir. So, for most of us, the situation in Kashmir is a news story, unfolding only on TV. But for anyone living there, and our guest this week, Ahmer Javed, it's life.
Kashmir to me is one of the most beautiful places you can go to because of its scenic beauty. So I felt that we were really lucky. I was a little kid and I used to feel that we were lucky that we have such a beautiful place.
Back then, there was someone in particular he loved spending time with.
My brother has been a huge influence in my life. I really look up to him. I still remember we used to go to the internet cafes and download wallpapers of rappers in HD and songs and other stuff that we used to listen to all day. He exposed me to a lot of good hip-hop music. He introduced me to 50 Cent, whose song in the club was the first song that I heard. And that was the introduction of hip-hop music in my life. Although I had no idea what he was saying in that song, but I just liked the vibe. I just loved whatever I was seeing in the video and how powerful he was as a person. So one fine day, not a very fine day, there was curfew and it was really intense. So what happens in curfews is that you have 2-3 hours of leniency. You can go out, you can buy stuff. My brother went out to get milk. These 3 guys of the forces stopped him and they asked him, "Where are you going?" So one of the army guys alleged that he was the one who used to shout "Azadi, Azadi," and he was straight up like, "Tu hi chillata hai Azadi, tujhe chahiye Azadi."
Now that word, Azadi, means freedom in Hindi. And it's a word we hear shouted by protesters all over India. So you might wonder, why it would garner the kind of reaction that Ahmer says his brother experienced. So it's really important to understand the context in Kashmir. Azadi is a very politically loaded term because it's also used by separatists who've been fighting against Indian rule and by militants in Pakistan.
So my brother was like, I've never been out for even a single protest. I don't do that, he said to the army guy. We are not one of the families who believe throwing stones or something like that would help. And the army people started beating my brother up with a stick. Then another guy joined him, and there were two guys beating my brother while other guy was holding him. So my cousin came up to them and started begging them to stop it. So they started beating him up as well. Me, I was in my washroom. I came out and I saw my mother. She was crying and screaming, they're going to kill him. I was too terrified to take it because I can't take it when my mother cries and I can't control myself. So I just went back to my washroom and I just locked myself. It was traumatizing. It was hard for me to see that, even imagine that. And I was too young. Growing up in a place like Kashmir, this is what we used to see. 4 or 5 months under curfew, not going out, not knowing why. Why are there too many army personnels? There are like 7 lakh soldiers.
Ahmer had an uncle involved in the political campaign for an independent Kashmir, who was killed back in the late 1980s, an incident which sparked the insurgency. Even though this happened way before Ahmer was born, his uncle's militancy ended up putting the whole family under suspicion.
See, my father has seen the conflict. He has seen the struggle way more than any person in our family right now. Because after my uncle's demise, he used to get picked up over suspicion. And he used to be in jail for quite some time.
For Ahmer, the conflict in Kashmir came right into his family life. It was there, every single day.
And beyond Ahmer's personal experience, human rights abuses in Jammu and Kashmir are an ongoing issue, with the Indian Army, the police, and various separatist militant groups all accused at some point of committing abuses against Kashmiri civilians and against each other. Even back in August, when the Indian government decided to strip the region of its autonomy, security forces were again accused of carrying out beatings and torture, an accusation the Indian Army says is baseless and unsubstantiated. And it's important to remember that over the years, the Indian Army has been a target too. Many Indian soldiers have been killed in attacks by separatist militants. So it's a very messy story. But for this podcast, we just wanted to find out what it's like to grow up there as a Kashmiri kid.
Teenage years can be pretty complicated for all of us. But for Ahmer, he had to grow up against a background of violence and fear all the time. He was looking for an escape. And he found it in music.
ये मेरा वक्त है और तुम वक्त से लड़ नहीं सकते इस आने वाले कल को बदल नहीं सकते अकल ये सरल लिया जो मुझे हल्के में होके फिर कत्ल शब्दों से होते हमले सुन कहानी ये अहमर की सुबानी ये रहमत सी सफाई ये मेहनत की नशहद ने भी मारा.
How old were you when you started to write?
So it started back in school days. I was 13 or so. We had a few friends, we had a circle, and they were all into hip-hop music. And we were sitting down one day, and one of my friends was like, we should write something on our own. Because I was one of the kids who wasn't like interested at studies and everything at all. I was like in my own zone, like I was that kind of a guy.
What were you thinking about?
I don't know. I was just lost. I used to be lost. I used to like overthink a lot about life and what's the purpose and what is it all about. You know, I was confused. And one day I decided to pen down something on my own, and I came up with something that was basically me impersonating black rappers full on, like using words that I'm not proud of. And the next day I went to the school and I told my friends, look, I just came up with something. And they were like, whoa, that is like unbelievable. But then it grew, that feeling of, someone appreciating you and you loving what you're doing. And I sort of felt the connection and I felt that I could do this every day. I won't get bored of it.
So it might be hard to understand that while Emma's friends applauded his growing talent, his mom, well, she wasn't a fan.
I used to write and stuff. I used to get beaten for it by my mother.
Oh yeah, she found out?
Yeah. She did find out. So she was checking my notebooks and my homework one day, and she just saw whatever I was writing.
Mm-hmm.
So she read some really gruesome words, and she was like, what the hell is this?
But Emma kept writing. He researched the history of hip-hop and had a kind of light bulb moment when he found out that rappers, like the blues musicians before them, use their lyrics to spread messages, including messages about civil rights. It inspired him. With what was happening around him, his father being arrested, soldiers everywhere, Emma understood that there was a lot that needed to be said.
So that was the spark that took place in my life, where I felt that conscious music was the way to go about life and about struggles that I had heard about in Kashmir. This wasn't just me being a victim, it was a lot of people who were suffering. And I realized that I really need to put my music out that talks about my people and my streets and what we see every day.
हाथों था मैं 13 साल का जिंदगी का माल ना मैं जख्मी इंसान सा झूठ का शिकार देता कोई ना जवाब था तो लिखता कलाम मैं तो स्कूल से ही शांत था क्लास में ना खास
Amir was the first Kashmiri signed to the label Azadi Records.
I just feel I'm blessed to be working with such people who really think the way I do, about world, about certain sensitive issues that need to be dealt with, The founder of the label, Uday Kapoor, is one of the guys who is deeply connected with Kashmir and what's been going on.
His debut album, Little Kid, Big Dreams, made in collaboration with Delhi-based producer Says on the Beat, was released this year, and it's going well. And Amir's been playing loads of gigs. Maybe you've even seen him. And this brings our story back to the start. Ishleen, where you first met Amir at a gig in Delhi?
Yeah, that's right. It was at a club in South Delhi. A bunch of rappers were performing and Amir was one of them. It was actually quite a cool vibe. I hadn't realized that Delhi had warmed up to regional rap. And as Amir started to perform, the crowd cheered, but suddenly he stopped. And
I wasn't going to perform tonight because the situation back home is really bad. You're not aware of what we are going through right now. You didn't need to know what the conflict's about and what's going on in Kashmir. We all need to speak up.
I don't know what had happened to me that day. I wasn't feeling good at all since morning. Knowing the rumors that were flying around about Kashmir, a chance of war and infiltration, phones and everything had been shut down.
thousands of Indian troops had been sent to Indian-administered Kashmir, schools and colleges were shut, and tourists were ordered to leave.
I had a discussion with Uday in the evening.
Uday, co-founder at the record label.
I was like, I'm not going to perform. The situation back home isn't that well. And he told me that this is the opportunity. You have to speak up. And I made up my mind. I agreed to perform.
He performed his set along with the unexpected statement and went home. The next day, there was an announcement.
अनुच्छेद 370 के खंड 3 द्वारा प्रदत्त शक्तियों का प्रयोग करते हुए
India's Home Minister Amit Shah said the government was revoking the law that gives Kashmir its semi-autonomous status, a law called Article 370.
And Prime Minister Modi and the Hindu nationalist Bharatiya Janata Party had long opposed Article 370. And revoking it was in the party's 2019 election manifesto. They argued it needed to be scrapped to integrate Kashmir and put it on the same footing as the rest of India and speed up its economic development. For people like Ahmer, who want Kashmir to be free of conflict, it was devastating.
Everything came crashing down because this was the only thing we had left in Kashmir. I couldn't think for the next 2 days. I couldn't go out. I felt like I didn't belong in Delhi.
Ahmer flew home to Kashmir. Ishleen, I think we could really do with a history lesson here. Article 370.
Okay, so let's step back. What it did was it allowed the state of Jammu and Kashmir its own constitution, a separate flag, and freedom to make some of its own decisions. However, foreign affairs, defense, and communications still remained the preserve of the central government. So Jammu and Kashmir could make its own rules relating to permanent residency, ownership of property, and fundamental rights.
Why did Jammu and Kashmir get this status?
Pakistan and India both claim Kashmir and they only control parts of it. Since India's partition and the creation of Pakistan in 1947, the two countries have been at war. There has been violence in the Indian-administered side, the state of Jammu and Kashmir, for 30 years because of hostility to the Indian rule there. And today, Indian-administered Kashmir is the only Muslim-majority state in India. And many Kashmiris suspect Hindu nationalist groups are encouraging Hindus to migrate there to, change the demographics of the state. And India blames Pakistan for fueling unrest, a charge Islamabad denies. So it's really complicated and it is very dangerous.
We want freedom! We want freedom! We want freedom! We want freedom!
What happened in August 2019 when they announced Article 370 would be revoked?
So once the announcement was made, there were protests in Kashmir, and that's why we had to cancel our trip there. Then we couldn't get in touch with Ahmer as he was in Kashmir and communications had been cut off. I should also at this point say that there's obviously more than one way to look at the situation in Kashmir, and our story in this episode tells it from Ahmer's perspective, the perspective of a Kashmiri Muslim, and is just unhappy with the way it was rolled out. But of course, there are other perspectives. So if someone from the Delhi government was sitting here, I think they'd say that Article 370 has held Kashmir back economically and that revoking it will encourage investment and bring progress to the valley.
And what did you find when you got there?
So when I finally got to Srinagar, I remember on our way to the hotel, we saw bunkers, checkpoints, almost every 100 meters.
Okay, over.
And when we went to Dal Lake, just for a walk in the evening, there was an eerie silence. Dal Lake is a very, very popular spot amongst locals or even tourists. Obviously, there weren't any tourists there, but none of the locals were there too. It was just nothing, but you could just hear the water. And it was a very strange feeling to be in Srinagar at that point. But while I was there, I met two Kashmiri artists, one a young poet and another a singer. Their names are Zeeshan Jaipuri and Ali Saifuddin. So Zeeshan Jaipuri is a poet and they're both actually quite famous in the valley. And the content they produce is extremely popular amongst young Kashmiris. And this is a generation which has grown up knowing nothing but this conflict. And the music and poetry is all about it.
नगर नगर है उलझने सहर सहर बुकाए दिल नजर नजर है बेहिसी बहर बहर
Zeeshan describes the situation of hopelessness and sheer despair in Kashmir. He says chaos and confusion has gripped his homeland.
सवाल हैं कि ख्वाब सारे ज़ेरे खाक सो गए सवाल कर रही हैं माएं जिनके लाल खो गए.
Where mothers wail for their sons, all hopes are dampened, hearts are broken. Ali Saifuddin is a singer. He said that what was happening now was nothing new, that he felt his life has been like living between curfews.
Imagine living in the most militarized zone on earth. That is a fact. And then again, the history of this place. It didn't belong to India before 1947. So that is something that living under that clash, the sentiment here is never static. We have never had a static life. Every day it's like some kind of revolution brewing in day-to-day life. We were born in the 90s kids where, you know, they had this legacy of being born in the conflict and the fear of those in uniform, like the army, the police. These were people you were supposed to be afraid of. And then when you grow up, you develop this anger and dissent and this power to resist them.
You were saying at one point that you were having a conversation where you mentioned we.
That's right. And as soon as they heard the word we, they stopped me and said, there's no we here. You're Indian and I'm Kashmiri.
Right.
And that's what stayed with me. And that's when I realized it's only when you meet young Kashmiris, you know how separate they feel and how life is for them to grow up in a place like that where you spend 6 months out of a year in curfew.
Yeah. But one thing is clear. Amer isn't going to be silenced, wherever he raps from.
I believe that when you are in a position where people are trying to escape just like you did through music and they're just craving for hope, and I believe that music should be something that just makes you feel. It should move you. I will always want my music to be as honest as possible. You know, I believe that music is holy and I can't lie on a track. There was a time when I was really naive with it, just trying to pretend that I'm hard. But when you realize that life isn't all about that, you know, and you really think, okay, down the line, are you going to be satisfied with whatever you just said? This isn't you. How about sending a message, giving them some hope of a better tomorrow?
Amer hopes that his music travels beyond Kashmir and reaches out to you and I to give us some idea of what it means to be living in constant conflict. It's been a very intense episode. It's been difficult to listen to a lot of the stories that Amer has described, but also it has given me a perspective that I didn't have before. And I'm grateful for that. You can tell us what you think of this story or any of our others. All you have to do is send an email to myindianlife@bbc.com. Our producer Ishleen has been looking at some of your recent messages.
So, if you heard last week's episode, you'll know we told the amazing story of Nisha, a young woman born with a rare skin condition. Throughout her life, Nisha has faced abuse from strangers for her appearance. And we heard horrible stories about people not wanting to sit next to her and all sorts of things. And yet, she doesn't let it get to her. As Nisha told us herself, happiness is a mindset. We on the My Indian Life team were hugely inspired by her story. And it seems you were too. Abhimon from Kerala has written to us and says, thank you for creating such an inspirational podcast. Whenever I go through a tough situation, I think about the lives of the people you speak to, and it helps to boost my confidence and willpower. Jaspreet has said, thank you so much for sharing Nisha's story. I believe in myself and in life more because of her. This is how it should be. Everybody must be accepted the way they are. And Roshni says, Nisha's story is so inspiring. A brave young girl who chooses to be happy. Kudos to her parents and her family for giving her such a good environment to be the person she is today. Her spirit is so calm and bright. Love her views on how she likes to live her life. We can surely learn and benefit too. Thank you, Roshni. And if you haven't heard Nisha's inspiring story, go and download it now. A big thank you to all of you who write in. Please do keep your comments and stories coming. Again, you can reach us at myindianlife@bbc.com. Now, back to you, Kalki. Tell us what's coming next week.
Thanks, Ishleen. In our next episode, we have a really surprising story. One you won't want to miss.
What it means is breaking out of these molds that gender identities have created for us. Yes, I am a woman, but I can also embody a man. I try to emulate a Persian prince. So I have a face full of facial hair, turbans, try to make it a bit kinky with all these chains around me.
That's our next episode, The Drag King. My Indian Life is an original podcast from the BBC World Service. I'm Kalki Keklang. Our producers are Ishleen Kaur and Prabjeet Bains. And thank you very much to our editor, Richard Fenton Smith.